So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Lissa Weinman. I am a member of the Windham World Affairs Council and also a partner in 118 Elliott, the venue we're here tonight. Thanks to my partner for letting me donate the space to things that I'm involved with. And welcome also to the people on our live stream tonight. We really appreciate you being here. This program tonight is really exciting because it's part of a new series we're doing called Blowback, the long-term implications of U.S. policy decisions. And it's part of an ongoing 3-year program that we're right in the middle of to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America, America 250. That's why you see some of those stickers at the table, because we've been programming and thinking about the title of our program, which is Examining American Leadership and Identity in a Changing World. So this lecture is part of that ongoing series. And we take that very seriously, along with our partners, Brooks Memorial Library. Thank you, Star Electronica, for your support and for everything you do. It's a lot. Also, the Vermont Independent Media, the publisher of The Commons, is a partner in that project, as well as the Vermont Humanities Council, who we're very grateful for funding this 3-year project leading up to the commemoration of America 250 next year. And we have a lot of really interesting speakers in store as part of that series. So thank you for being here. I just want to remind you that Windham World Affairs Council survives because of membership dues and donations you make at events like this. That's our sole source of income, actually. So I would encourage you to join us as a member. We have a growing, very vital membership, and it's just a great place to exchange ideas. We do monthly salons, and some perks of membership are having things like private dinners with speakers, like we're going to do tonight. So we're going to ask people to clear the room before 8:30 because we're going to have a seated dinner here tonight with the speaker and some board members and friends. And so that's kind of a perk of membership. We have some really interesting programming coming up in the next couple of weeks. Wednesday, June 11th, we're going to have Elliot Derringer, who's also in the audience tonight. Hi, Elliot. He is a former U.S. diplomat, worked with John Kerry as the right-hand guy on climate change initiatives globally, back when climate change was something you could say publicly. And so he'll be talking about the state of the global efforts to combat the crisis, the true existential crisis of climate change. So that's going to happen at the Broadbrook Community Center, because we're trying to very actively go out to new venues and bring in new members. So join us at the Broadbrook Community Center, right off Guilford Center Road, on June 11th to hear Elliot speak. And then on Tuesday, June 24th, just a couple weeks later, we have really a packed month on June. We're going to have David Bollier. Who knows David Bollier from the Schumacher Center for New Economics? He's a really renowned person in this sort of the idea of the commons and how we can build a better future together in different ways. So the talk is The Great Promise of the Commons, and boy, could we use a great promise right now. So that should be a very inspiring speech. And then I just want to mention with America 250, part of what we're doing is trying to create a space for conversations about how to commemorate that. And Brooks Memorial Library every 4th Wednesday makes the community room available from 6 to 8 p.m. And we put out a little food. And we have a conversation, and people are planning stuff. They're planning puppet shows. They're planning parade. People are planning things for next year to commemorate this very significant anniversary in many different ways, many different political acts. So we would welcome you to join us, and so that's the 4th Wednesdays. And in June, the 4th Wednesday is June 25th, and we're going to have one of the members of the Vermont America 250 Commission join us, Brianna Sheehan. She is a Native American and Elnu Abenaki from right here in the Brattleboro area, and she is going to be joining us and talking about, things from her perspective. So that will be a very special gathering at Brooks Memorial Library on that date. So that's about it. As I said, please join, please support, and please, attend these great events. I have the great privilege of introducing Chuck Collins, who's going to introduce Stephen Kinzer tonight. Chuck Collins is also a member of the Windham World Affairs Council, and probably one of the strongest voices we have in this country on the impact of inequality on our democracy today. And he's been doing that work for a long time, starting right after Hampshire College, organizing people who had mobile home owners to own the land beneath their homes. And so he's really been doing this work for his whole life, and we're so appreciative of his efforts. He's written many books, including Born on Third Base, his first book, which was a New York Times bestseller. And his newest book is Burned by Billionaires.
Yeah.
I don't want to smile, but thank you. How concentrated wealth and power are ruining our lives and planet. That is coming out in October, but I get to hold this now, so we're really excited about that. So he runs the inequality.org website, which is just an amazing resource on so many things from private jets to billionaires' bank accounts. And he's been running that program at the Institute for Policy Studies, which is helping underwrite the program tonight. So thank you very much, and let's give a warm welcome to Chuck Collins.
Thanks to Lissa and John for this remarkable space. And the video tonight will be rated R because of that. And also big thanks to Susan Healy, who really kind of coordinates and does a lot of the coordination of all of these events that you've heard about. So thank you, Susan Healy. And I'm excited because this is the first of a series of programs we're doing on this kind of theme. We call it Blowback, but let me say what we mean by that. And I should say, when I was in high school, I had two friends who were Iranian students who went to my high school. And I remember one time we were having a conversation, and they said, well, we kind of need to go to a quiet place that's secure. And I was kind of like, well, what's up with that? And they're like, well, there's this SAVAK, the secret police, the Shah's police, and we know they're in this country, we know they're in the US, and they're monitoring people like us who are students. And so I was like, oh, okay. And then, a couple of years later, we had the Iran, the hostage situation where the US embassy in Tehran was taken over, and for almost, more than a year, hostages were held. And I remember talking to my Iranian friends who said, well, this is really goes back to 1953. And, 1979, the hostage. I said, 1953? That was like before I was born. I mean, who remembers this stuff? And they said, well, everybody in Iran remembers it.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the purpose of our series is, I think we kind of lean toward amnesia when it comes to understanding what we call the long tail of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Intervention and regime change, how that lives on. And we may not think about it. And if you remember after 9/11, there was this whole why do they hate us? So well, maybe you should crack the old history book here and try to understand U.S. policy in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Pakistan and places like that. So the whole idea of this series is to look at the role of U.S. foreign policy, and particularly maybe look at the history of specific countries. So we are going to have we had a speaker who was an Iranian documentary filmmaker, Amir Amirani, who's going to come this summer. He co-produced a film called Coup 53. 1953 was the coup in Iran. And but he's like, why should I come to the United States right now?
Yeah.
So we understand that. But a colleague of mine, Sarah Anderson, is going to come in the fall and do a talk on Chile, the coup in Chile, the U.S.-backed coup in 1973, that led to decades of dictatorship and destabilization in that country. Fortunately, they've sort of come out the other side a little bit in terms of restoring a democratic society. But I think that's the idea. And I remember not long after kind of learning more about Iranian history, I came across a book called All the Shah's Men, written by this guy, Stephen Kinzer. And then later I was in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and lo and behold, I meet this guy who's like the correspondent for the New York Times in Nicaragua. He wrote a book about brothers, what's it called? Yeah, Blood of Brothers, sort of about the divisions within Nicaragua. And then I go up to Guatemala, and a friend of mine hands me a book called Bitter Fruit by Stephen Kinzer about the coup in Guatemala. And so I can't think of a better way to start off this series than by having Stephen Kinzer come and speak to us and kind of give us, sort of step back and give us an overview. And he actually wrote a terrific book, kind of like the greatest hits of U.S. intervention, Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a terrific book, and I recommend, and there are a number of other books. In fact, I heard him, last time I heard him speak, he was speaking about a book he'd written about the Dulles brothers, Alan and his brother, who ran the CIA and the State Department and pretty much presided over decades of interventions. So with that, I am just thrilled to welcome Stephen Kinzer to Brattleboro. Let's give him a Brattleboro welcome.
After that introduction, there's not much left to say. It's wonderful to be here in Vermont, and particularly in Brattleboro. There's so much history, and really a history of, I don't want to call it resistance, but a history of independence.
Oh, yeah.
Let's call it that. This has always been a place where independent thinking has been the mainstream of life here, and that's one reason it's so wonderful to be here. I'm also happy to be here because it's sponsored by the World Affairs Council. I have spoken to World Affairs Councils all over the United States. I'm telling you, this is a really vital group. It's very important, and it is.
I'll lean in just a little so people can hear you there.
It's an organization that's widespread across America. At this moment, this organization, the World Affairs Council, is probably more important than ever. So I just want to reinforce what you already heard about the importance of people being involved in these issues. It's a cliche to say that Americans are not interested in world affairs and don't vote according to foreign policy. Now, it's probably true that Americans are ignorant about the world,
Yes.
but people in many other countries are also ignorant about the world. There's a difference, though. If people in Paraguay don't know anything about the Middle East, it's really a shame. They should, because it's interesting. But it doesn't hurt anybody. But our ignorance is different. We bomb out of ignorance. We kill people out of ignorance. So that's why organizations like this are so important, because they combat this ignorance. And it's wonderful to be here with people that are involved in that confrontation and struggle. Haven't been in a room with so many nudes for a long time. Those of you that are watching on live stream, you're missing half the show, but I'll try to I got to think of another kind of intervention, not the kind that is drawing my attention from what's on the walls. Intervention really is the central question of American foreign policy, because intervention is what we do. Intervention is us. The United States was formed by immigrants. And immigrants tend to be people who are a little bit more willing to try new things. They're more aggressive. They're not satisfied with where they are. And that's why they came here. But they carried that with them, that ethos of not being satisfied where you are. So you could argue that the United States has been expanding and intervening ever since the Pilgrims moved from Plymouth to Boston. And that intervention ultimately concluded with the realization of what was called manifest destiny. That is the takeover of North America by European settlers. Now, in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier was closed. There's no more room to expand. So the United States essentially had been expanding westward ever since well before independence. And now we get to the point where we've reached California and we've settled everything in between. And comes a big question, now what do we do? So that was our manifest destiny. That was what that phrase meant, settle North America. Now we have manifested it. So what do? Do we use the resources that we have to try to build up our own country and make it a model for the world? Or do we keep expanding? It goes back to that famous speech that many of you heard about in 1630, the City on a Hill speech. John Winthrop famously said, "We shall be as a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us." I think we're still arguing about what that meant. So did it mean we're going to create a virtuous society on a hill and it will be a model for others? Or did it mean that we have a redeeming mission in the world and we cannot stop until the entire world has been liberated and made free for our ideas? We still haven't figured out what that means. And I think there's a kind of a pendulum in the American mindset, or an inbuilt contradiction. I think most Americans truly will believe that every country should be allowed to find its own way. But they also believe that the United States has found the best system in the world and should make other countries come along, and will be so churlish for us not to share all the wonderful insights that we've had that made us into this great country. So there's an inbuilt contradiction. Everybody should be free to make their own decisions, but if they're smart enough, they should make the decisions that we want them to make. And if they don't make those decisions, then we need to do something to help them make the right decisions. That's what I love about the rules-based order. Is we make the rules and we give the orders. The concept of the rules-based order is that other countries cannot be trusted to govern themselves because they're run by people that essentially are greedy and they're self-interested. They're not interested in the general good of the world, but we are. And therefore, everybody should submit themselves to us. When we intervene in other countries, we like to think that in the long run, it's going to be good for them. But even if it isn't, we still think it's the right thing to do because it increases the power of the United States, and that in itself is something that's a gift for the whole world. The United States is sometimes referred to, and I'll go back to a word that you heard in the introduction, as the United States of amnesia. We never look in the mirror. When you look at the commentators you see on the news, they're all the people that told you the Iraq War was going to go great. That's how you get to be a commentator, get to be promoted, get to be a big figure in the United States. When you said the war in Iraq is going to go terribly and it's going to be a disaster, you never get a job in Washington. Being right is the absolute death sentence in Washington. When you're wrong, you can stay there forever and you'll be on CNN or Fox News for the rest of your life. So, I said intervention is the central issue of American foreign policy. Where do we intervene? When do we intervene? Under what circumstances do we intervene? With what tools do we intervene? So the United States is such a big country. We're going to be intervening in the world. Just by looking at the map, you can see that. But how are we going to do it, and why, and when? One of the things that comes to you growing up in America is this sense that everything will be fine in the end because we're America. Especially the class of people that produces our national leaders. These people often grow up with the sense that Daddy's always there. So if things go really wrong, somehow Dad will call the judge and it'll be all worked out. And they carry this mindset, I think, into office. They feel like, well, we're going to invade this country. Things might not go well, but if they don't, we're America. We're going to fix it all up. And then if it doesn't work well, we'll just forget about it. And as you heard in the introduction, Americans forget about our interventions right after they happen. We move on to the next subject. But the people in those countries never forget. Those memories burn in their hearts and their souls and their minds, and they're transmitted over generations. This is the big difference between the way we see the world and the way many people in other countries do. And I sometimes have asked myself, why do I see the world differently from the way so many other world affairs analysts see it? And I think the answer might have to do with experience. We are all products of our experience and our backgrounds. So most people that speak and write about world affairs in the United States are based in Washington, and they have a very rich resume. So they went to a graduate school in political science or international relations, then they went to work on a congressional staff, maybe they worked in the Pentagon for a while, they worked in a think tank, they worked in the State Department. They have all the experience you'd ever want, right? They've been all over town. They've been on 1st Street, they've been on 5th Street. And when they want to write stories, the journalists among them decide, well, I'm going to call my guy at the State Department, I'll call my guy at the Defense Department, I'll call my guy at this think tank, and I've talked to everybody. That's how they learned about the world. They learned about the world in Washington. I didn't learn about the world in Washington. I was a New York Times correspondent for many years. I learned about the world from the countries that were the victims of American foreign policy. They were under the bombs. We saw the results of foreign policy. In Washington, you don't see the results. They're very diffuse. It's all kind of like a movie that just ends. It's not really human tragedy. So let me just go through a couple of these greatest hits as we talked about them, and give you an idea of what the long-term results of these operations have been. So the CIA was created in 1947 and began its covert operations almost immediately. 1948, big operation to assure that our candidates won the election in Italy. Very large, fascinating operation in which the CIA mobilized Italian Americans to send letters to all their relatives back in Italy, warning them that if they didn't vote for the right candidate, America was going to cut off all aid to Italy. Italy would be devastated, and it worked. So the CIA then ginned up this idea that we wouldn't just intervene in elections, but we could actually overthrow governments that we didn't like. One of the threads that runs through American history that you saw in the Cold War and you still see today is the sense that it's not possible for the United States to exist in a world that we don't dominate. If we don't run the world will go into chaos. This is something that I think the American foreign policy establishment has deeply integrated into their head. That's another example of how we don't look in the mirror. We really think that our influence is all that saves the world from chaos, when actually it's often the opposite. So, the CIA got into the business of overthrowing governments. The first time it happened was in 1953 in Iran. The prime minister was legally elected. Iran had been a dictatorship. After the Second World War was over, an incipient democracy emerged. And it was the great hope of the whole Middle East. Unfortunately, the leader of the country, being democratically elected, had to respond to the interests of the people of the country. And in Iran, the overwhelming national issue was our country is sitting on an ocean of oil, but all the oil is owned by one company that's owned mainly by the British government, and we don't get any money from this. Now, as long as there was no democracy in Iran, people were not going to complain. But once democracy emerged, there was a movement promoted by a unanimous vote in parliament to nationalize the oil resource of Iran. That set the CIA into action. It wasn't just that we thought we were going to lose Iranian oil. It was bigger than that. The threat was that other countries would follow Iran's example and begin to nationalize their own resources. They would then set the prices and the conditions by which those resources would be exported and shared with the rest of the world. We didn't like that. The idea of the United States and the West was that the consuming countries should set the conditions by which they extract resources from the producing countries. And when the producing countries rebel against this, that set the CIA into action. In 1953, the CIA spent the summer trying to overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. And it succeeded. It only took a couple of months. A huge amount of history came out of those couple of months in the summer of 1953 in Iran. So just spin it forward. We didn't just overthrow one leader. We ended Iranian democracy forever. We brought the Shah back. We placed him on the peacock throne. He ruled with increasing repression for 25 years. He was finally overthrown by a group of fanatically anti-American mullahs who have spent the last 40 years intensely and sometimes quite violently working to undermine American interests all over the world. So this is a great example of a coup that devastated the target country, but also undermined the security interests of the United States. I think with great pain of all the generations of Iranians that have had to live and still live in a society in which they're not able to fulfill themselves. Iran was on the road to being some kind of democracy in the Middle East. And let me tell you, all the other leaders in the Middle East were watching what happened in Iran. And after that coup, they came to the obvious conclusion: the United States will not support a democracy in the Middle East, because democracies are going to lead to challenges about oil resources. Therefore, we shouldn't have democracies here. We should rule as dictators. Then the Americans will like us. And that is the paradigm that has created the modern Middle East. So it was so successful in Iran that the CIA decided to do the same thing 10 months later on the other side of the world, here in Guatemala. We didn't like the government of Guatemala. It was an elected democracy. They also had a resource, bananas, controlled by one American company based in Boston, the United Fruit Company, which was intimately connected with the US government. Again, you have a democracy. The first thing that Congress wants to do is right the economic imbalances. So the Guatemalan Congress passed a land reform law requiring giant landowners who had land that they didn't use to sell that land to the government. The biggest landowner was, of course, United Fruit. United Fruit called up its friends in Washington. A coup was set in motion, and the president of Guatemala and the democratic government of Guatemala was overthrown in 1954. That set off decades of horrific violence and civil war in Guatemala. Over the next 30 years, more people were killed in political violence in Guatemala than all the rest of Latin America. Forget Chile, El Salvador, everything else you've heard. Guatemala was the great Central American Holocaust. And that was imposed by regimes that were placed in power after the United States destroyed Guatemalan democracy. So there's a couple of cases from the very early history of the CIA from which the citizens of those countries have still not recovered. And again, we don't think about these anymore. It happened so long ago. You just heard from Chuck, somebody thinking to themselves, well, 1953, that was so long ago. It's very American to think, what could anything that happened 75 years ago have to do with politics today? Yeah, it does. Those coups, like the coup in Guatemala and the coup in Iran, might be considered great successes if only history stopped. If only history would stop the next day. But history doesn't stop. It keeps unfolding. Now, the United States has continued this history of intervention with particular interests in various parts of the world. For example, now you heard about the U.S. overthrow of the government of Chile in 1973, an episode with which many of you are quite familiar. For me, one of the most interesting pieces of documentation about that coup is a wonderfully insightful memo that Henry Kissinger wrote to Richard Nixon in the White House about, it all explains why we have to act in Chile, why we cannot tolerate Allende in power. And his rationale is Allende could give a good example. He said the problem he poses to us is his success. If Allende can succeed with a socialist government and then leave power when he's supposed to and have an election and allowing whoever else is elected to come to power next, maybe Italy will try the same thing, and maybe France will do it. We have to stop this. We have to make sure he cannot succeed. This is such a damning admission from inside the United States that what we really want to do for countries that are not following our model is make sure they fail. Don't wait till they fail on their own. We want to say they always fail if they adopt these policies, but maybe they don't. So we got to make sure that they do. I want to mention another great little example that shows how American interests work in these operations. In 1989, the United States invaded Panama to overthrow Manuel Noriega. Before that invasion, the commander of the Presidential Guard in Panama came to the commanding American general and said, "You don't have to overthrow Noriega. I'm going to do it. Our guys can do it. All I need you to do is block the one road that leads across the canal so the reinforcements can't come. I will then, with my men, we'll overthrow Noriega." The Americans refused to do that. What was the reason? The reason is we didn't just want to overthrow Noriega. Noriega was the commander of the Panamanian National Defense Force. That PDF, Panamanian Defense Force, was a very nationalist institution. It was mainly non-white, and it didn't support the interests of the United States. So getting rid of Noriega was not enough for us. We had to crush the entire institution. And that's another example of how the United States not only wants to overthrow governments, but change entire systems by which people are governed. Now, I want to move up to and conclude or reach a climax with an intervention that I don't think has been fully understood. And that's the United States intervention in Ukraine. Now, put aside what you think about the Ukraine war. Is it an imperialist, expansionist adventure by the Russians, or was it provoked by the West? You could have a long argument about this. But one thing I think is important to understand is the length and intensity of the American role in Ukraine over more than half a century. In 1949, the CIA began dropping paratroopers into Ukraine, armed with weapons, to go fight the Red Army. We were fomenting civil war and guerrilla war in Ukraine in the 1940s and early 50s. The reason was that we decided correctly that Ukraine is the best battering ram against Russia. Russia was our great enemy, so anything you can do to promote anti-Russian feeling in Ukraine, anything you can do to promote Ukrainian nationalism and make sure that nationalism is anti-Russian will be positive for the United States. All through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, particularly in the 70s when Brzezinski came in and advised Bill Clinton, and then Reagan came in, American operations in Ukraine were ceaseless. For 40 years, the United States sponsored a publishing company in New York called Prologue that was dedicated to publishing books to be smuggled into Ukraine and dropped by air. They were all nationalist tracts aimed at trying to foment anti-Russian feelings in Ukraine. The United States was working with some of the most brutal Ukrainian commandos who had worked with the Nazis during the Second World War and helped commit horrific massacres. One of the main figures in charge of those massacres was brought to the United States to run this Prologue publishing company. Then, in the 1980s, the CIA went through quite a metamorphosis, and you can see it as you observe the change in our approach to Ukraine, but you can see it elsewhere as well. So, you'll remember that in the 1970s, there were a series of revelations about the CIA. That's when we found out they were spying on Americans at home, that they had been involved in Chile. There was a whole cascade of revelations about the CIA. And the CIA didn't like this. And it wasn't good for America's image in the world. So one possible reaction might have been, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But no, give me another option. So the Americans came up with a very interesting new option in the early 1980s. In the old days, the way to destabilize the government was very familiar. It was a pattern. So the CIA always has a station on the top floor or second to top floor of every American embassy. So in that station, there would be CIA officers who would then fan out through the country and get to meet people who work in political parties, get to meet the newspaper editors and so forth. Next thing you know, they're passing money around to people. Political parties are suddenly being split. There's dissident factions emerging. They don't like, then there are protest demonstrations in the street against how bad the government is. Then there are independent newspapers, as they're called, and independent TV stations springing up. Pretty soon, you have the country in upheaval, as the CIA has secretly been seeding this opposition. But it turned out that that style of working produced tremendous blowback. It wasn't good for the United States. So the Americans decided during the Reagan period to come up with a completely new approach. The CIA will no longer be responsible principally, as it has been in the past, for destabilizing foreign governments. And it's not going to be secret anymore. These were the two great changes. It's not going to be the CIA. We're going to set up a whole group of so-called private organizations, NGOs, that will pose themselves as simply being for democracy promotion and civil society. And they will act openly. They will openly give grants to people that want to start their own newspapers or people who want to promote certain ideas that we like. If you want to come in and say Ukraine should be in NATO, come in. We've got a lot of money for you. You can open up an office. Don't you want to hire a few other people in other cities? So Ukraine became a proving ground for the new style of intervention. And this was carried out in other countries too. These are what's called the color revolutions. You had the Rose Revolution and the Orange Revolution. So this is the new style of American intervention in the world. We don't use the CIA. We don't really do it secretly. Actually, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, the big difference between Israel and other countries is they're proud of it. It's right out there in the open. And now that's really what the United States is doing. So the United States worked intensely in Ukraine, putting in, by the estimate of the person who oversaw this project, Victoria Nuland in the State Department, $5 billion into, quote, civil society of Ukraine. We created a whole kind of alternative ecosystem to fight against the government that was neutralist. We wanted a government that would be responsive to us, so we could then turn Ukraine into that great battering ram against Russia. And that succeeded. In 2014, the government of Ukraine was overthrown by a series of public demonstrations that were largely seeded and fomented by years of work from these so-called NGOs and democracy promotion organizations. So, the United States is definitely not out of this business. We heard during the last presidential campaign some promises, particularly from Trump, that we would stop doing this and we would take another approach in the world. So far, we haven't seen any real evidence of any kind of new approach. So, you come to this final question. The United States is going to intervene in the world because of what it is and its history and its size and its traditions. But under what circumstances should it intervene? So this is how boring us intervention nerds are. We sit around and have beer and we talk about what would be your set of criteria. When do you think we should intervene? So we make up little lists, like we should intervene if these things happen. And I would say it's probably pretty boring pursuit for people that are not in that business. But I want to share with you a conclusion that I came up with from looking at certain lists. Colin Powell actually came up with a great list. You know, these people get so smart when they leave office. You know, he lied us into the war in Iraq. And then later on, if you listen to his critique of what he did, you think, boy, I'd like this guy to be in office. That is so common. That's another speech. So Colin Powell came up with a list that I've kind of adapted. And I like this one for the conditions that should be met before the United States intervenes violently in another country in the world. Okay, I'm going to list 4 conditions, 4 criteria. Number 1, a vital interest of the United States is at stake. Number 2, the American people support this intervention. Number 3, there's a clear goal and an exit strategy. And number 4, there is no way to achieve this goal other than military force. When you can reach all of those 4 criteria, then I think it's reasonable to intervene. So there are all sorts of criteria. Should we only intervene when there's an ongoing genocide? That would mean almost never. Should we intervene whenever there's trouble in the world and people are being brutalized? That means always. So we have to find some kind of a balance. The United States has intervened more often in more countries further from our own borders than any country in the history of the world. The question that faces us for the future to me is this one. I see this as the central question of America's future as it deals with the rest of the world. Are we ready to accept a world in which we are not the absolute dominant power? So the world is changing, and at least in a relative sense, American power is declining. Are we willing to accept this? Now, I look at the history of the countries that are very old. Iran is the oldest country in the world. China's up there too. Why do they survive so long? It's because they ride with the currents of history. If you read Iranian history, they've ruled the world, first great empire. Then they went down, and they went up, then they went down, then they went way, way down. Oh, they had terrible centuries. Then they were up a little bit, then they were down, then they were way up again. This is the way countries survive over millennia. The United States has not learned this lesson yet. And if we want to have a longevity, something like China's or Iran's over the coming centuries and millennia, we have to recognize that our place in the world, and no country's place in the world, is dominant, is permanent. Things are changing in the world. The United States has not changed quickly enough with them. There's some tremendously positive forces going on out in the world today. And the United States has an opportunity to latch onto them. We really are at a possible turning point. I'm so happy that we got rid of the Obama, Clinton, Carter, Nancy Pelosi approach to the world. And frankly, for me, if Donald Trump did 2 great things, one was he killed the Clinton dynasty, and another was he killed the Bush dynasty. Thank you. But you want to have something positive to replace what's killed. We're still looking for that. So I think we can say that the old ideas that the Democratic Party has been imposing, particularly over recent decades, are over. This idea that we instinctively have to go everywhere where there's any upheaval and impose our will is fading. But nothing new has yet emerged to replace it. So I think we are in the world as at home in a moment of great turbulence, but I think there's more opportunity for hope, I think, in the outside world. I'm very troubled, as I'm sure all of you are, by what I see happening in the United States. But I do think there's possibilities for some positive changes in the world. It requires, above all, a constituency in America that wants to promote those changes. And when politicians can constantly get away by saying, Americans don't care about world affairs. Americans never vote on anything that has to do with foreign policy. That gives them the freedom to continue to act the way they are acting. That's why I'm so thrilled to see all of you here, and why I hope World Affairs Councils here and all across the country continue to do this great work that you're doing. Thank you.
Maybe we're two
Sure.
questions just for the audience at home.
So yeah, I'm willing to take some questions. Let me just mention one thing. So since I spent many years as a journalist, I have this idea. So, journalists have great stories. We're great dinner guests. Our knowledge is a mile wide, even though it's only an inch deep. And so I had this idea. I'm going to write my memoir. I'll tell all my great stories. So my book editor told me, terrible idea. Don't like it because the only people that buy the memoirs of former foreign correspondents are other former foreign correspondents. That's too small a market. I was shocked. But another editor told me the same thing, so I guess he was telling the truth. So now I'm going to tell you one thing about my memoir that will never be written, and that is that I have a title. In my other books, I write the book, then I try to think of a title. Now I have a title for a book that's never going to be written. But this is the title that encapsulates my whole approach to the world. It's a quote from a movie, an old screwball comedy that some of you may know called Arsenic and Old Lace. Yeah. Remember that one? So the story is, as many of you know, that Cary Grant goes to visit his elderly aunts, and he discovers that they poison the people that are staying in their guest house, the elderly guests. So there's a scene where one of the elderly aunts says to Cary Grant, "Oh, the gentleman died because he drank wine that had poison in it." And Cary Grant's eyes kind of pop open and he says, "But how did the poison get in the wine?" I want that to be the title of my memoir. The wine of world peace has been poisoned. But how did the poison get in the wine? I think I've devoted my whole life to trying to answer that question. Okay, go ahead, yes.
Would you speak about Taiwan?
Who's listening? You know, I love the free press, and some of you may know that I'm the world affairs columnist for the leading newspaper in New England, the Boston Globe. But I can't write about Israel, Gaza, and I can't write about Russia, Ukraine, and I can't write about China, Taiwan. But all those little questions are off my agenda because my views don't coincide with those of the editorial board. So, I believe, in fact, this is one of the columns that made me realize that I have to stay away from this subject. I wrote a column saying Taiwan should really be thinking in the long term about what kind of an arrangement it could make with China under unification. The Globe would not publish this article. So here's what I think is going to happen in Taiwan. I think there are two options. First of all, the Chinese are 100% dedicated to doing this. It's 100% sure they're going to do it. And their explanation, it has something to do with Abraham Lincoln. They're saying, you fought a huge civil war to unify your country. Hundreds of thousands dead. And how are you going to criticize us for wanting to unify our country? When you drive around China now, as I've been told, you see a lot of posters that have Mao Zedong, then they have Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. So each of the first two did something spectacular. So what's Xi Jinping going to do to match the other two? I think his idea is, before I die, I want Taiwan back in China. However, I think the Chinese are very acutely aware, as one Chinese diplomat has told me, you Americans still haven't gotten over the Civil War. You're still angry at each other. We don't want that in Taiwan. We don't want a war. Then we'll kill people, and they'll kill us, and they'll be angry at us for generations. So we want to do it in a different way. So I think their preferred option is to wait over a period of 20 or 30 years, start doing what we do. start bribing politicians, you get politicians to start businesses, then you urge them to go into government, and pretty soon, after 30 years, you've got enough people in parliament that want to make a deal with China. And so I think that's what's going to happen, unless Xi Jinping decides he wants to get it done right away, in which case it will have to be done by force. So I think Taiwan's future is definitely part of China, and I think it will be in Taiwan's interest right now to try to figure out how to make that arrangement work best. I think the Taiwanese are not going to fight to save Taiwan. I mean, it's smaller than Massachusetts, and the part that's occupied is just one little strip. But I have this terrible fear that there are people in the United States that think it would be a great idea for us to get involved in a war 5,000 miles away from our coast that's 100 miles away from the other side's coast. So I don't think there's necessarily reason to panic now, and I don't think the Taiwan case is tied closely to the Ukraine case. But my advice to Taiwan would be to realize the inevitability of the future and don't panic and continue to negotiate and see what kind of conditions you can arrange.
Is there a parallel between that and Cuba and the United States?
The Cuba thing is really one of the most outrageous pieces of craziness the United States has ever imposed. I mean, and again, talk about feeling sorry for generations of people. What we imposed on Cuba over 70 years is really a huge crime, and there was no reason for it. You know, Pierre Salinger was Kennedy's press secretary. He told a great story, which I saw in a televised interview. He said, one day I get a phone call from President Kennedy. It was right after the Bay of Pigs, and he says, I want 1,000 cigars. I want you to get me 1,000. He gives them a specific name, the Cohibas. I want 1,000 Cohibas. So Salinger said, well, I got in the car and I got a driver from the White House pool, and we went around to every cigar store in Maryland and Virginia. And I came back the next morning, and the president said, so how did you do? And he said, well, I've got you 1,000 Cohibas. And Kennedy took a piece of paper out of his desk and signed it. And he said, I've just signed a trade embargo on Cuba. There will never be any more cigars or anything else Cuban in America. He got the last 1,000. And the day after, he signed the embargo. So that shows you how unseriously he took it. And we have worked for 70 years to try to change the politics of Cuba. We've completely failed. However, we did succeed in changing the politics of Florida in ways that were very bad. Yes?
What's your speculation about what President Trump is talking with the president of Syria?
The Syria situation is just appalling. I mean, here you have a person who was such a brutal terrorist, even Al-Qaeda didn't want to have anything to do with him. And the United States is now dealing with him as a friendly leader. Now, if you want to learn about Syria, I got one little phrase for you to look up. Go home and Google Timber Sycamore. Operation Timber Sycamore. The United States spent $1 billion to overthrow Assad because we hated him exactly for the reason that we didn't like Mossadegh and Arbenz. He wasn't going along with the program. He was a dissenter. He had his own way of doing things. There was no attack on the United States. There was no undermining of American security. But we didn't like him because he wasn't towing the line. So for years, Operation Timber Sycamore supported the worst terrorists, not just in Syria, but in the whole world, to come to Syria and fight against a guy who was a dictator, but who had imposed a secular regime. Now we have the Alawites, who were the supporters of the last regime, being slaughtered, minorities not being protected the way they used to be, and the idea that we couldn't deal with Syria while Assad was in power, but we like to deal with it when this head chopper is in charge, is another example of the overly transactional relationships that we have. And when looking at the Middle East,
president after president has said, we've gotten too deep in the quicksand there. We have other problems in the world. The United States should not have its thumb on the scale in the Middle East. If the United States lightens its footprint in the Middle East, the different countries in the Middle East will have to come together and make their own security arrangements. And that's what they should do. But the United States always pushing on one side makes it difficult, not only in the Middle East, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, for local countries to establish their own security arrangements, because those arrangements are not always favorable to the United States. So it's very distressing to me to see this extreme war criminal now putting on a suit and tie and being welcomed by people who, I guess it makes sense, are also in a way war criminals. Yes.
Your talk has taken us remarkably into many, many places. My father was in the U.S. diplomatic corps, so-called, when the Shah was imposed. My uncle was in Guatemala after we got rid of Duarte. And maybe you and Chuck and I were all in Nicaragua in the 80s.
I see you at Los Ranchos one night. You were the one that had the medium rare steak. I remember, yeah.
And I was going to ask you, and you can take your pick of my questions because I have to develop the second one, but I was going to ask you to talk about the trajectory of Daniel Ortega, who when I was in Nicaragua was the liberator, was a hero. But you've introduced some other issues that are in some ways alarming to me and interesting to me, because it seems at the end of this trajectory, you are advocating that yes, the U.S. needs to continue and have its list of when intervention is required. And it's with top of the list interests, and the U.S., who knows nothing about the world, supports it. That's just government propaganda that we're talking about there. If the U.S. supports an intervention, it's because of being brought along. But so the more interesting question I think for us today is talk to us about this assumption, and I may have gotten you wrong because you're talking, it's much more nuanced than that the U.S. really should continue to intervene throughout the world.
Well, that's a very profound and serious question. I guess in my ideal world, countries would not intervene in the affairs of other countries. In the real world, though, being a smaller country, living near a big country, means you don't have complete freedom in world affairs. Ask Honduras. They know. You have to adjust yourself. So I just look at the map and I see that big countries are always going to intervene in the affairs of other countries. Why do we do it? Well, that's another long lecture, but in the end, I think it's really for the same reason that little boys fight in the sandbox. The one wants something that the other one has. Remember the Vikings had the line, what you cannot hold is not yours. And really, I think the Americans and other colonial powers have taken that as their motto. So the only reason that I think about criteria for intervention, rather than hoping there won't be any intervention, is that I have a dose of realism, and I realize it's going to happen. So couldn't we restrict it in ways that would limit the number of interventions that cause this huge amount of blowback? One thing I would like to see is that the U.S. Congress would read the Constitution and find out that Congress is solely responsible for declaring war. And it's not allowed for the president to send troops somewhere on his own. Of course, there's an agreement between the president and the Congress that Congress shouldn't have to do this. Congressmen don't want the responsibility. They want to be able to escape responsibility if it goes badly. And the presidents love this. So there are plenty of ways to restrict intervention in ways that would make it less likely to produce these terrible blowbacks in the future. You know, I think if we could get President Eisenhower back here and ask him, why did you do this terrible thing to Iran and this terrible thing to Guatemala? He might have one good answer. And the answer might be, you know, you up there in 2025 have been able to look back and see all the terrible results of CIA intervention. But we were just starting back then. I didn't know. I never thought through what the long-term interventions would be. And to me, this is one of the great weaknesses of American government, is that we don't think through what's going to be the reaction when we do this. And then how are we going to react to that reaction? And then what's going to be the reaction to that counter-reaction? That's the way you're supposed to think about the world when you make decisive actions. And we don't do that.
But let me allow a little follow-up, which is, I don't think it starts with Eisenhower. Look at our claiming of a third of Mexicans.
No, it's different though, because only under Eisenhower did we begin to use covert intervention.
Okay.
In the old days, we just used to send the Marines. It was Plan A. I don't want to skip over your other question just very briefly about Daniel Ortega, because I was there and I've watched that whole tragedy. It's political, but it's also psychological, it's familial. Ortega has, I think, grown up in a world where there was a family dictatorship, Somoza, and I think that was his frame of reference. We thought he was rebelling against that, but actually he was a product of it. And then you have this very bizarre piece of the Ortega story, which has to do with his wife and daughter. So you'll remember the story that Ortega's daughter announced in, I think, 1999 that he had been sexually abusing her starting when she was 13 for 10 years. And then came the big crisis for Ortega. That was the end of his career. It was all up to his wife to say, is this true or not?
And
She knew it was true.
What is her name?
Rosario Murillo. She knew it was true. But she also knew that if she admitted it's true, his political career is over, and I'm going back to run that cafe in Banagua. Or if I lie and say she's not telling the truth, she made it all up, I can be the most powerful person and run the country. And that was the Faustian deal that they made. And now Ortega has become the bloodiest dictator in modern Latin American history, which is something I never would have expected. But as I said, you need a psychologist to untangle that relationship.
Although isn't there a little bit of a U.S. foreign policy blowback story there that hardened the Nicaraguan regime again?
What I really see is the mistake the Americans made, even worse than supporting the Contras. They made another worse mistake afterwards. I hated the Contra War and I hated the Contras, but I got it. I understood it. From Reagan's point of view, it was a logical thing to do. It fit in with his mindset. But after the Contras lost, then we had this great democratic election in which the United States was very active, and we produced Violeta Chamorro, a wonderful civilian democratic leader. We then forced her to adopt this so-called Washington consensus, where you cut all subsidies, suddenly the bus rates triple, suddenly the bread gets much more expensive, and then they cut about 300,000 jobs. That's 300,000 families, from government agencies, because the Americans wanted them to do that. So every one of those families then had a house and a car. Suddenly they have nothing. They're lost. They're out of normal life. And so at the end of the Violeta Chamorro regime, the Nicaraguans were saying, hey, this democracy thing really is bad. We hate it. So it was American policies that had the chance to build up Nicaragua when we had a civilian government, a leader who we supported. But we did the opposite. We forced her to impose policies that turned Nicaraguans against democracy and made them think maybe it's better to bring back Ortega. Oh, go ahead, in the back.
What do you feel the effect of a genocide that the United States is perpetrating in Palestine is going to have in the future
I think it is going to have an effect in the future for one reason. So I'm a professor. I deal with 20-year-old kids all the time. And I'm telling you, this Gaza episode has deeply marked them.
Is what?
Has deeply marked them. What Vietnam was for my generation, shaping our whole view of the world for our whole lives, this is Gaza. I'm telling you, these kids are watching it, and they are horrified. They are outraged. The line, United States is the protector of peace and justice in the world, is finished with this generation because of Gaza. And I see this as really potentially the nurturing of a new consciousness, a new generation. If this new generation becomes more anti-interventionist and more realistic about what America can and should do in the world, the reason is going to be Gaza.
I think American intervention, United States intervention, isn't out of ignorance. It's out of real interest. There were interests in Honduras. There were interests in Korea while they supported Sigmund and Reed. There were interests in Persia while they supported.
No, I think you're right. I think, no, we act on behalf of interest, but the ordinary American is the one who believes, well, it's all for the good. It's all going to work out well. So, yeah, at the top, they don't fool around with those kind of excuses. They understand what they're doing. But selling the intervention to the American people requires a completely different vocabulary from the one you use inside the government when you're planning it. Go ahead.
I'm glad you mentioned Boys in the Sandbox, because humanity has evolved in so many ways. Humans have evolved with science, art, all kinds of things, Olympic superiority. But war is very primordial. The methods have evolved, but the mentality is still where it is. And with the new technology, instead of using it against each other, we have the ability to use it collectively to create a planet and a human race that can survive. We will not survive at the rate this is escalating in, and it's primordial. And as people here know, I like men, and it's more patriarchal. I'm always in awe of how the male species has this amazing ability to organize collectively, whether it was World War I, World War II, in which my father was a sergeant in the Marines. And my history goes way back, and I'm very proud of it. And the ability of the male species, and women too, don't get me wrong, to work collectively. And now it's time to evolve and use that energy in other ways, to create, to be diplomatic, to educate. And you can still have armies. And the men can still use those wonderful, beautiful physical skills they have, but maybe they could have mock wars. and
That's what the World Cup is about.
The Olympics. And there's ways and to create and to build. Men can do far more creative and amazing stuff collectively than this primordial beating each other over the head and destroying innocent people that are just trying to live their lives and enjoy this beautiful planet we live on. Thank you.
That wasn't a question. I would just add, you're right. I mean, one of the great mysteries of the world is that we have so much.
Yes.
We have enough to make everybody happy. We don't need to be doing this. This is really the great overwhelming mystery. Why is it? You know, our ability to build the weapons and to be mechanical has progressed so fast, but our moral sense, our sense of how to use the technology that we have, has not progressed that fast. And that's really dangerous, that there's a big gap between how much we can do technologically and how smart we are in realizing what we should and shouldn't do with our technology.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to your desire to sort of have Congress reclaim the War Powers Act, there's sort of two ways that can be done. One is de jure, go back to the actual Constitution. And then the other one would be de facto, how do you do it in reality? I sort of see two difficulties. The first one is that and this speaks to the de jure, no one really declares war anymore.
That's true.
I mean, the United States hasn't declared war since the mid-1940s. I believe it was 44 or 45 is the last time war was declared. I mean, even Russia doesn't declare war when it invades another country. It's a euphemism, just like Korea, just like Vietnam, So given the fact that countries don't declare war anymore, how do you go back to reclaiming a constitutional provision that seems to me to be obsolete? And then the second question is de facto. War now is conducted via social media, as we know from our defense secretary. It's conducted by drones. It's conducted by remote in real time. You don't have mobilizations of armies. And so both de jure and de facto, how do you go back to a constitutional reclamation of the War Powers Act?
How much time do we have? First of all, you're right. We don't declare war, and that's why we say we don't need the War Powers Act, because we're not at war. We have people shooting, other people are shooting at them, but it's not a war. I think that the way to reclaim constitutional order in the United States has to do with the individuals that you send to Washington. A lot has a big impact. And it's not just people that have to come together in a majority. Even if you don't have a majority, a few voices can really make a difference. And it's really depressing to me to see how few there are. I mean,
Bernie.
I like Bernie. Yeah, Bernie's one of them. But let me tell you, I had a meeting about Iran with my congressman, and I brought with me a guy who's a Washington insider who deals with Iran issues. He deals with Congress all the time. And he sat there the whole time, didn't say anything, because it was me and my congressman. And we left. As we were walking down the corridor, I turned to my friend, who's a real Washington insider, and I said, I can't believe how dumb that guy is. And he looked at me and said, let me tell you, he's smarter than half the guys up here. So I've never forgotten that one. So I do think there is hope in the institution, but people make institutions. And I think one of the great ways to judge the success of a society is how well it pulls the best, most qualified people in society into government and public service. And by that standard, we really are failing. I mean, in China, just about every single person on the Politburo has a PhD. And they've been working their whole life in government all over the country. Now, of course, they've got their own problems. You can't criticize the government over there. But we are not bringing good people into government. And when I say we need better people, a lot of people that I know who I think would be great would say, why would I want to lower myself to put myself in this environment where all I have to do is beg for money on the phone and then get down there and be beaten on the head all the time? So I have great admiration for those who work in Congress and trying to beat some sense into people down there. But I do feel that we need a few voices. And I like what Bernie is doing, but I still feel that even Bernie is not focused enough on the world. I think all these great movements that have emerged in the last decade, like Black Lives Matter, and there's so many climate change movements, I think it's all great. But I have a big complaint about those movements, and that is they're not making the connection between what they're looking for in the United States and what we're doing in the rest of the world. Every time you stand up and say, we should have health care for everybody like they do in Canada and every other developed country, the answer is always the same. We can't afford it. We don't have the money for that. Well, yeah, I got money. I got $1 trillion defense budget. Well, there's plenty of money out there. I got 800 military bases around the world, and we don't even need 80 of them. Yeah, there's plenty of money out there. So if you want to reform America, you have to look at reforming America's approach to the world.
So I just want to speak to when you answered his question about the powers that be know exactly what they're doing, and the belief in the American way of the regular people comes from the speech you cited and The City Upon a Hill by John Winthrop speaking to the Puritans, and it's invoked by Reagan in the 1980s, and it creates that Reagan revolution. And I taught US history for 30 years to high school students.
It's God's work.
And that, in the 1980s, there was the best reform in education, 1988, 1989. We went into multiculturalism and respecting the fact that this was not a whitewashed version of American history that we should be teaching. But that 1980s invocation is what made American exceptionalism one of the major themes in US history classes. And many of us push back against that, but and I say all the time, I know that in that period of time I taught, I was responsible for creating, for perpetuating creation mythology. But then, over time you have experience and you get better at it. But, and many of us push back against that concept and was talking about this is what's creating our problems, and we were talking about that during the Bush years, and we were talking about that during the Clinton years. But now, the way this government is going to regulate education, we really, your talk was, I can't say uplifting. You're a great speaker, but you're bringing so much experience about what has been happening around the world for so long, and it's what you're citing is happening here right now. So what, not letting them take public education away. The causes are local, and I just want to thank you. That was really incredible.
Well, I'm a public school graduate myself, and I'm a great believer in public education. Who knows, we may be sharing a cell before too long, and we'll have a lot to talk about.
Could you talk a little bit, since you're well versed in Latin America, could you talk about Venezuela? Because it seems like Venezuela is like Cuba writ large to me. We tried to overthrow Chavez. I don't know much history about that country, but I know we tried to overthrow him at least once, and then he got back into power, and we devastated that country with embargoes, and now millions have gone to destroy that country. But part of my statement is not just to hear myself talk, but to ask you, is that true that we're responsible to a large extent by our embargo of hollowing out and devastating that country, and now millions are coming here and to Colombia and fleeing because life is untenable there? What's our responsibility? Because it seems like we treated them like we treated Castro. We said fuck you from the get-go.
Well, the Venezuela situation is just completely heartbreaking. I mean, it was a country that was actually functioning pretty well. It was ruled by kind of a white elite. They had a two-party system like ours, which was, one group of families and one other group of rich families. But there was a measure of prosperity there. So then,
They got loads of oil still.
exactly, they're a big oil producer. So essentially what happened is, when Chavez came into power, he was a flamboyant leftist and he liked Fidel Castro. So we decided we can't tolerate this. I mean, the real reaction should have been, well, okay, it's Venezuela. Let them spout off. Let them be pro-Castro. It's not hurting us. But no, we couldn't do that because, again, it's just like Assad. He was off the reservation. He's defying us. And that's the central problem that attracts intervention all around the world from the United States. So Chavez was at least able to keep the country going despite the sanctions because the oil was flowing well. Then after Chavez died, things got really worse. Chavez at least had a charisma. He had an ability to understand the masses. He had a connection. The guy who's in power now, Maduro, doesn't have that. I think the country has gone down, down, down. And it's a great combination. You know, Maduro and U.S. sanctions together have brought that country down. And my feeling is Maduro, it's Venezuela. Let them, if they want to collapse, they want to have economic policies that have been proven failures, fine. Let them fail, but don't push them to fail. It's not in our interest to force them to fail. And when they do fail, look what happens. Just what you said. Huge numbers of refugees are spreading all over South America, creating huge problems in other countries. So it's another example. You talk about blowback. It's blowing back right to us. Does that feel good now? Do you feel good about hurting Chavez now that you've got hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans fleeing the country and coming to the U.S., Chile, and Colombia? So it's really another completely self-defeating and really heartbreaking, totally unnecessary intervention. I think we're getting about to...
All
right, let's just take one more question.
One last question, and then we're going to wrap.
Okay. My question is about R2P, like the international norm of R2P, and like how I personally feel like it's a norm that's died over the years.
Is this R2P? Is that what you said?
And I feel like in the U.S., like our minds about international, our interactions with the global community as a whole have been really like shifted by the media. And I think like Darfur is a really good example of how like, the U.S. was convinced that they must intervene. The same with Libya and Iraq and so on. And I guess then my question then is like, what do you see R2P ever being able to end? Like, do you ever see it being?
So let me just repeat the question and explain it a little. She's asking about a policy called R2P. It's short for responsibility to protect. The theme of the R2P idea is that when something awful is happening in the world shouldn't just stand by and let it happen. You have a responsibility to protect victims. I don't like R2P because to me, responsibility to protect means responsibility to intervene. Oh, I see, somebody's being killed over there. I gotta go bomb them. This is the American impulse. Of course, we only apply it when we feel it's appropriate to the governments that we want. We are so selective. You know, we have so many lists. We have lists of governments that support money laundering, governments that support human trafficking, governments that don't allow religious freedom. We've got about 25 lists of bad countries. So we're always happy to point out the failings of other countries. And when they reach a certain level, it means we have to intervene. And the American public is so susceptible. They are so easy to manipulate. If you show me a picture on the cover of Time magazine of some girl that got acid thrown in her face because she tried to go to school, and you say, we gotta bomb that country. This is the American approach to how we solve problems in the world. So R2P is one of those ideas that sounded great on paper. Yeah, responsibility to protect. Shouldn't everybody protect every poor victim? But really, when you unpack it, it's, to me, just another excuse for trying to provide a humanitarian face for self-interested and often very devastating American interventions. And just to go back to my first point, those devastating interventions not only devastate the target countries, but they undermine America's role in the world.
Oh, yeah.
On that happy note, thank you all for coming.